Hello. This tutorial is in response to a comment we received asking how to show buy and sell arrows on the screen. And that comment was received on one of our tutorials on writing a MetaTrader indicator step by step. So you can see the arrows I have here showing up and down arrows. Now the request was showing buy and sell arrows. I can show you how to print the arrows on screen. Determining whether you want a buy or a sell signal is entirely up to your strategy. So I'm choosing a default strategy here. What I'm going to do is take the indicator that I used in the earlier tutorials, being this ribbon indicator. It's a 3 moving average indicator, and it displays the fast and the slow moving average with a filled space between, and leaves a gap where the signal moving average, or the even faster moving average, doesn't align with the other two. I've just used this in the tutorials to date, and it seems sensible to use the same thing given the request was made following one of these tutorials. So I'm going to show how to display these arrows, being the up or the down arrow, when we come out of a gap in this ribbon. And I'm going to demonstrate that for MetaTrader 5 and MetaTrader 4. I've got the editor open here, and I've already created the files for the ribbon with arrows for both MQ4 and MQ5. I've got them both open in the same editor here. Just in case you didn't know, I like to keep my MQ5 and MQ4 in the same place. It makes it much easier to share. And another little trick that works at the moment, let's just see, using version 5 build 2302, this is the editor open from MetaTrader 4. This editor will compile MQ4 and MQ5 files, and that file will work in MetaTrader 5. The MetaTrader 5 editor, if you launch it from MetaTrader, won't compile the MQ4 files, but it will work if you run it from the command line. I like to have them in one place, and this makes it easy for me to edit both files and compile both. So these are the new files with arrows, but the code in here is just the code without the arrows at the moment. And if I compile both of these, I can go to, this is the MetaTrader 4 window. You can see I've got the ribbon showing with the histograms and no arrows. And if I go to the MetaTrader 5 window, I also have the histogram running with no arrows. So let's just walk through this first. If you haven't seen the earlier videos, I recommend going to see those, where I walk through this in step by step, but it has changed a little since I created those videos. So let's start with the MetaTrader 5 code, and I'll do this very quickly. So there are 5 buffers. There are 3 moving average numbers that I'm going to calculate: the signal, the fast, and the slow. And I'm plotting 3 things, which is the fast moving average, the slow moving average, and the histogram, or the ribbon on screen. So that's 3 plots and 5 buffers. Then I'm defining each. So plot number 1, indicator type 1, I'm drawing a line. That's the fast moving average label. I'm coloring that blue. It's a solid line. And here I'm setting a value that I'm going to use to associate the buffer with this indicator. So the series number for the fast is 0. And then the second is the slow moving average. Again, it's a line. It's indicator number 2, and that's going to be series number 1. These are always offset by 1 until you get to the filling type indicator. So this is indicator 3 being the next, and the channel is 2 also being the next, but this uses 2 channels, and that's why I'm specifying 2 colors here. And when I first created this tutorial, I actually had the draw filling histogram at the beginning, but that threw out this relationship of the series number being 1 less than the indicator number, because this takes 2 series. So I've moved it to the end. It just makes things a little neater. And then I've got 1 more series that doesn't display, which is where I hold the signal buffer. And because the draw filling has taken 2, I've incremented this to series number 4. Then the input parameters, so slow, fast, and signal moving average periods and modes. Then I create the buffers where I'm going to store the calculated information. There's the fast moving average and the slow moving average buffer and the signal moving average. I also need to create specific buffers to hold the moving averages for the ribbon. It can't simply reuse these two buffers. They're already dedicated to drawing two lines on the screen, and so I just needed to create two additional buffers to hold those. Max period is just a variable that I'm going to be setting later to show the largest of these three numbers, which should be the largest of the three periods, which should be the slow. And then these handles, fast, slow, and signal handle, are indicator handles that I'll be using. So max period, as I said, that's just the slow moving average period. I'm assuming everything's been set correctly, and the slow is the largest of the three. Then I'm assigning buffers, so my set index buffer for fast, assigning to the series fast variable that we set above. I'm using the fast buffer, and this is a data indicator, meaning that the value does show up in the data window on screen. And then I'm associating that with the plot. And I'm saying plot draw begin, which tells the indicator which is the first bar to begin drawing this plot. And since I need to have at least the slow moving average period, I can't plot anything before that. So that's why I've used max period here, and I'm simply reusing there. And then I'm doing the same for the slow, series slow, and for the channel then, because as I said it uses two buffers, I have two set index buffer statements where I'm using first the channel and I'm attaching the fast channel, and then I'm using channel +1 and attaching the slow channel. And I don't want these values from these two channels to show on screen, so I've set the type here to indicator calculations. And then finally the series buffer, same thing, I'm still setting an index buffer, and again indicator calculations. Then these three lines are just setting up the handles to the moving average indicators. And on dinit, if I've managed to create these handles, I simply want to release them, so I'm calling the indicator release functions for each of those handles, and then into the loop. Testing is stopped several times in this loop, so that if there is some reason to stop running this indicator, I will stop that as quickly as possible. If I don't have enough rates, then I'm checking for each of the indicator handles if enough bars have been calculated. So if the bars that are calculated there are less than rates total, I'm simply going to return. And then in this section, I'm setting the number of bars to be copied into the buffers and which bar to start with for those. Another check for is stopped. And then this is where I'm copying the buffers from the indicator handles into the appropriate buffers. Then down here is where I'm doing the calculations to determine what to display. So I'm looping through based on the start bar that's calculated above, and what I'm saying in these statements effectively is that if the three moving averages are not aligned, and that meaning that if they're aligned if the signal is above fast and fast is above slow, or in reverse if signal is below fast and fast is below slow. So these two statements are simply testing to see if that's true or not. If not, then it means that for some reason, because the signal has started to move and crossed back across the fast buffer, then it means that we don't have an alignment, and that's where the ribbon, if I show the ribbon here, that's where we get these gaps in the ribbon. So at some point here, the signal line has crossed the fast line, and so the ribbon cuts out until all three are aligned again. So if those are not aligned, because I've already filled in the values using these copy buffer statements, what I want to do is erase the values in order to create the gaps in the ribbon. So if the three are not aligned, I'm simply setting the fast and slow buffers to the empty value, which will stop the lines being drawn for those two moving averages. And then for the fast channel and slow channel, I'm setting those values to 0, which creates the gap in the filled ribbon. And that's all there is to the basic indicator for MetaTrader 5. It's slightly different from MetaTrader 4, so I'll just flip across to look at that one now. This is the original indicator for MT4. It does work slightly differently. Indicator buffers are 4 here, and I'm having to use a histogram. If you have a look at this, you'll see I don't have a nicely filled ribbon. I'm using a histogram here. You can increase the width of the lines on this histogram to make it more solid, but that draw filling that I was using in MetaTrader 5 isn't available in MetaTrader 4. So the histogram is the way to go. Histogram first needs to be drawn or needs to be defined before another line. The reason for this is that when a histogram is drawn, the vertical line is drawn from the value in the histogram down to the value in the next buffer. So my channel up buffer is going to draw a line down from whatever value I set in the histogram buffer to the value in the slow buffer. And if I go back here, what I'm saying is that when the slow buffer is at the bottom, then I'm going to draw a line down from the histogram value, which I'll later be setting to be the fast value, and the line will go down and stop at that slow buffer. So for the up histogram, I'm defining this is indicator number 1 and it's series number 0. Then the line for slow moving average is very similar to 5. I've just used different indicator numbers. And then we get to the histogram for down, and this actually works the same way, but when I define this, it will be drawing down from the slow value to the fast value. So I've defined the histogram here, and then I define the fast line below that. Inputs are the same. I have a fast and a slow buffer, and I have an up and down buffer for the MT4 indicator. Then I'm doing similar things, set index buffer, series fast. I probably don't need this line because I've already assigned a label above. So I'm just assigning the buffers for fast, slow, up and down. Then in the loop section, I'm doing a similar calculation to know if I've got enough rates, if they're less than or equal to the slow moving average, which is intended to be the larger number, then I'll simply return. Then I determine how many lines to calculate, and then it's a simple loop through. Now in MetaTrader 4, there are no indicator handles, so this statement is giving a single moving average value back. I'm getting those into the fast, slow and signal moving average variables. This is a similar test to MetaTrader 5, but I'm using these variables instead of the buffer values. And then if it's trending up, I'm assigning the buffer fast will get the fast moving average and the slow gets the slow moving average, because if we're trending correctly, then both of those lines need to appear. And then I'm setting the up buffer to be the fast value. So this will draw the histogram then downwards from the fast to the slow line. And if I'm trending down, then I'm going to assign, again, fast and slow moving averages to their appropriate buffers, but the down buffer will get the slow moving average value. And then the histogram line will be drawn downwards from the slow, which is the top line, to the fast, which is the lower line. And if neither of these trends are true, then that's where we'll get the gap in the ribbon. And that's all there is to the MetaTrader 4 version of this. So now let's move on and start making the changes to add the arrows in MetaTrader 5. Now, starting with the MetaTrader 5 indicator, the first thing that needs to change is the number of buffers and plots. I'm going to add 2 more of each, one for the upward pointing arrows and one for the downward pointing arrows. So that will become 7, and that becomes 5. Now I'm going to insert the arrows at the beginning of this list. I have found, for reasons that I can't explain, that if I place the arrows after this draw filling histogram, then I simply cannot display arrow symbols. They will display as dots. If anyone out there knows why that might be, please leave a comment. I'm always happy to learn, but the only way I could find to solve the problem was to draw the arrows before I draw this histogram. So I'm going to place them at the beginning. So here I've added the two arrow indicators. The type is a draw arrow. The first one's going to be for the buy arrows, which will be upward pointing. I'm going to make them blue solid arrows, width 1, and I've set a series value here. My buy is going to be series 0 because that matches with indicator number 1. Then I've got the downward arrows or the sell arrows, and that gets series sell, which is 1. Now I just need to renumber these indicator values, so I'll just do that quickly. So I've simply changed these indicator numbers, increased them by 1, and increased these series numbers, also increasing by 1. So I've still got series, so now I have series channel 4 for the filling indicator. I'll also mention I could have set the label, the color, and the style, and even the type. I could have set all of this in the code, but then you lose the ability at the input screen to change the color and the style. So I've left these in here. It's up to you if you want to put those inside the code or not. The inputs aren't going to change. I'm just adding arrows to the screen. I need to add 2 more buffers now to store the up and down arrow buffers. Just the same as the other buffers, I've just called these buffer buy and buffer sell. I also need to determine or define the character values for the up and down arrows. So I'll just create some definitions for those. So the up arrow is a character 233 and down is a 234. And this arrow shift I'm going to be using, and I'll demonstrate where it happens, but if I draw these arrows at the high and low prices, they will actually overlap the top and bottom of the candlesticks. This arrow shift can be used to move them, and in this case I'll be moving them 15 pixels away from the top and bottom of the candles. So now I need to make my definitions for the up and down arrows. So set index buffer just as before, but again I don't want to show the value of this on the data window, so I'm just setting this to indicator calculations. Then I'm doing the same max period setting that we have in others. This line where I'm defining plot arrow, this is where I define the character number that we had here. So the up arrow 233, that determines which symbol is going to be plotted, and this is where I'm using the arrow shift. Now for the up arrow, which I'm going to be printing at the top of the candle, I actually need to use a negative value on arrow shift. And for the down arrow, which I'm plotting at the bottom, I need to use a positive number on the arrow shift. So positive numbers move the arrows down, negative numbers move the arrows up. Other than that, the indicator sell is the same as the indicator buy settings. After that, the next changes to make are here in the loop. I'm not going to copy buffer into the buy and sell arrows because they only occur occasionally. So instead, I'm going to insert values here in this loop section. And initially, I'm going to set both of those buffers to the empty value. Then, in this section, after I've set the channel values, I'm going to determine whether an arrow needs to be printed or not. So, as long as I is greater than 0, meaning I'm not doing the very leftmost bar, because I actually need to compare to the bar before. So if the fast channel on the previous bar was equal to 0, and here I'm saying that I'm setting it to 0 if the moving averages don't line up. So I'm saying in this statement, if I'm just coming out of a gap in the ribbon, then if the current fast buffer is above the slow buffer, so I'm in an upward trend, then I'm going to indicate a high. And because I'm looking for just coming out of a gap, this will only appear on the very first bar after the gap disappears and I begin the upward trend. And the opposite to that, if the fast buffer is not greater than the slow buffer, then I'm in a downward trend. Now, this piece of logic, testing just coming out of a gap, and if I'm in an upward trend according to the two moving averages, that is the strategy logic that determines when to print a high or an upward or a downward arrow. So to the question to show how to show buy and sell arrows, I'm demonstrating here how you can print arrows on your screen. This logic is for you to determine based on your particular needs. So this is just my example logic here. So I'm setting the buy buffer to the high price and the sell buffer to the low price, depending whether I'm in an upward or a downward trend and just coming out of the channel. And that is all the change I need to make. Let me just make sure that will compile. No, I have made a mistake. Indicator sell. These should have all been series buy and series sell. I'll just make that change. Now in the ribbon, and because I compiled this with MetaTrader 4, I don't have an automatic refresh here in MetaTrader 5, so I just need to do a refresh. Now here we can see I have a down arrow there on this candle, which is just at the beginning of a downward ribbon. Then there's a gap in the ribbon here, and it starts again there, and I have another downward arrow. If I scroll the chart backwards, I have the same thing here where I've just begun an upward ribbon and I have an up arrow just above the top of the candle. More up arrows here. So that is how we add the arrows to MetaTrader 5. Let's go back to the editor now and we'll see how to do the same for MetaTrader 4. In MetaTrader 4, I've made the same initial changes. I've increased the number of buffers and I've inserted my arrow indicators at the beginning, being numbers 1 and 2, and then bumped up the numbers of all the other series and indicators to match. Like MetaTrader 5, I need buffers to store the arrow values, so a buy and a sell buffer. I'm also going to define the arrow values, same characters, 233 for an upward and 234 for a downward arrow. I'm adding arrow shift, but MetaTrader 4 doesn't have the same statement for doing the plot shift that is in MetaTrader 5. So I won't be using this initially, but I'll show you a trick to move the arrows. Now I need to do the index settings for the arrows. So here I'm setting the style as an arrow type solid blue. This is a statement that's really just duplicating what was in the definition above, but I've included the full statement here. I'm using the up arrow character, set index arrow. I'm setting the buffer to the buy buffer, and I'm setting the label. Again, this label was set above, but I'm demonstrating how you can do the same things inside code. And then I'm doing the same for the down arrow, setting the style to be a solid arrow, width 1 and red, and it's using the down arrow character. Now, as I mentioned, this line arrow shift, that doesn't exist for MetaTrader 4, so I have no way of moving the arrow. So for the time being, I'm going ahead without doing that. And that's almost everything done. I just need to insert the code here Just like in MetaTrader 5, I'm going through the loop for the buffers, and at the end here of the loop I'm going to insert some code then to determine which or when to print the arrows and which arrows to print. And these are my statements for drawing the arrows. Just like with MetaTrader 5, I'm setting the buffers to empty value initially. I'm doing that for everything just to make sure that I don't print arrows by accident. And then I can't test on the first bar. This is opposite to the way MetaTrader 5 worked, where I was looking for bar number 0. I'm now testing to see if I is less than the size of the buffer or the size of the array that I have those buffers in. So as long as it's less than that, then I'm doing a simple test here to see if I'm at the start of a down. So if buffer down for the previous bar is 0, and here I'm setting buffer down to 0 for everything and only resetting it if we come out of a blank space. So if buffer down is 0 on the previous bar, I plus 1, and the current buffer down is not 0, then I've started a downtrend, and so I set the buffer cell to the low value, the low price for the bar. And then the opposite. If buffer up was 0 and now is not 0, then I've started an upward trend, so I'm setting the buffer buy to the high price for that candle. And that's all that's needed to actually print the arrows on screen. I'll compile that. And then we go to the MetaTrader 4, which has automatically refreshed. And I'll have to zoom in here a little for you to see, but it has printed an arrow here at the beginning of that downtrend. It's printed another arrow here just after coming out of the blank space. If I scroll backwards, it's printed an up arrow here where I've just come out of the blank space into an uptrend. But you can see that these arrows are overlapping the top of the candle there and the bottom of the candle here. Now this is where I'm going to show the trick that I have for moving these arrows. Just before I show you moving the arrows, I noticed that I previously had these set to empty value and I was getting a line of arrows across the bottom of the screen. So these should have been set to 0. Now to move the arrows, it's not quite as simple in MetaTrader 4. The arrows are placed according to a price, and I want to move the arrows by a number of pixels, not by a price amount. And obviously the chart size changes as prices move up and down, and we get different numbers of, or a different range of prices shown on screen. So I'm going to introduce a variable here that I'm calling price shift, and I'm going to calculate the number of pixels based on, or I'm going to calculate the price movement to achieve that number of pixels movement. So I've included the arrow shift here, which you remember above we set to 15. I'm calling this function to convert that 15 into a price amount for the screen. So let me just add the function down below. So here's my pixels to price function. This input is the number of pixels that I want to move by on screen. So I'm defining a height in pixels, minimum, maximum, height in price, and shift. So height in pixels comes from the chart get integer function, which is telling me how high the chart is in pixels. And you can see there, chart height in pixels. Then I'm using the chart get double to find the minimum price on the screen with chart price minimum, and the same for setting the max variable to the maximum price on screen. And if we go back here, minimum price on screen is right down at the bottom here, that number, and maximum price is this number, and that changes because as the chart moves and you get wider or narrower ranges of prices, you can get a different price range showing on screen. So with those, the height in price is just the difference between the maximum and the minimum, and then the amount that I need to shift by to achieve this number of pixels is pixels multiplied by the total height in price of the screen divided by the height of the screen in pixels. and then I just return that. So that gives me this price shift value, and then when I draw the arrows I can simply move them by that price shift. So if I compile that now, you can see that the arrow here has moved away from the candle, and the down arrow has also moved away from the candle by 15 pixels. So they're now clearing the tails of these two candles. The disadvantage of doing this with MetaTrader 4, you can see that I actually have values appearing here in the data window, and they are going to show the price where these arrows have been set, which is not the same as the price of the candle. So you'll just have to understand that that's happening if you're moving these arrows around. And MetaTrader 4 didn't give me an opportunity to hide these values. One other problem though that we still have with this, if I change the scale on the chart, let me just do it with zooming in and out, you'll see that the arrows are getting closer or further away depending whether I zoom in or out. They're not maintaining that 15 pixels distance. There is a way that I can get around that involves redrawing these when the chart changes. So I'll just demonstrate that as well now. So to begin, I'm going to store the value of price shift between loops. So I'm just going to create a static variable for price shift, and I'm going to calculate a temporary variable for pixels to price. Then after I've done the calculations of how many bars to redraw, after I've calculated this limit, I'm going to add some statements, and if the latest pixels to price is not the same as the earlier pixels to price, so if p shift is not the same as price shift, then I'm just changing this limit variable to rates total, which means that I'm going to redraw everything. And finally I reassign price shift to be the same as the new value. So by redrawing everything, all of the arrows are going to be redrawn, and they're all going to be redrawn with the new pixel size. Let me make sure that compiles. It does. If I go here now, and if you watch closely, you may see these lines or the arrows move, because they do wait until the next tick happens before they will redraw. And you can see them occasionally just getting closer when I'm zooming in, or further away when I zoom out. It might not be the most elegant way to achieve this, but it does work. If you want to go to some more trouble and actually redraw on chart events, you can do that. I just found this works. Doesn't cause too much of a lag, and that's fine. So that's everything for drawing arrows on screen. Just like with MetaTrader 5, the logic here of when I want to draw the arrows, that's entirely for your decision, determined by your strategy. I'm only demonstrating here how to place the arrows on the screen using the buffers. So that's the end of the demonstration and tutorial on how to add these arrows to the screen. If this has been useful, please leave a like. If there are any other topics you'd like me to cover, then please leave a comment and we'll add them to our list. And if I can manage it, I will reply to your comment to let you know when we will cover those topics. If you want to see more of these videos, then please click the subscribe button and click the bell icon to receive a notification when the videos are released. Until next time, thank you for watching.